Welcome to Machiavelli in the Ivory Tower, a videocast series on arms control, non-proliferation, and related international security issues. I'm Sarah Bidgood, Director of the Eurasia Non-Proliferation Program at the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies in Monterey, California.
And I'm Hanna Notte, Senior Research Associate at the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation.
Join us as we discuss cutting-edge research and what it means for real-world decision-makers. Whether it's nuclear doctrine, deterrence dynamics, regional challenges, or the state of international regimes, there's just so much to talk about.
And with our guests, we'll break down how their analysis can help us make sense of a complex security landscape.
In each episode, we'll bring Machiavelli into the Ivory Tower.
Thanks for watching. We're glad you're along for the ride.
Welcome to Machiavelli on the Ivory Tower. Our guest today is Dr. Rachel Whitlark, who is an associate professor at the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs at Georgia Tech. Rachel, we're so thrilled to have you with us here today, and thank you for making the time.
It is delightful to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Rachel, let me start with the first question about a book that you had out in 2021 with Cornell University Press called All Options on the Table. Can you just tell the listeners who are not familiar with your book, who haven't had a chance to read it yet, what's the story with the book and what are the questions that you asked and answered?
Sure. So the book seeks to understand something that is a little bit strange, a little bit puzzling in the world of international politics, which is that sometimes we observe one state use military force of some variety to try and stop another country that is in the process of trying to develop nuclear weapons. To put that in political science speak, if you will, for a minute, it's about understanding and explaining the variation that we see in the use of preventive military force as a counterproliferation strategy. So why do we see the use of force as a counterproliferation strategy sometimes, but other times not? And the way I came to this question, this book, it actually started from world events. So I was observing things in 2002, 2003, and you'll remember that one of the things that happened in that period was that the United States went to war in Iraq, ostensibly because of Saddam Hussein's pursuit of nuclear weapons. And, you know, that was a thing, and we're still thinking through the ramifications of it today. But at least on one level, it struck me as puzzling because the previous year in 2002, the international community, the United States, had learned that Iran was pursuing an illicit nuclear weapons program, and the United States did not go to war in Iran. And I thought, okay, that's kind of odd, right? These are seemingly similar countries, seemingly similar cases, big Middle Eastern, countries with hostility to the U.S. interests, allies, et cetera. We go to war in one and not the other. And I was like, I don't know what to make of that because they seem very similar and we see two very different things happen. Fast forward, if you will, a little bit to 2007, and history kind of repeats. In the fall of 2007, the Israelis attack what we now know was a secret Syrian nuclear reactor that was part of a developing Syrian nuclear weapons program. And again, I was kind of like scratching my head. This is strange because the Israelis since 2002 had been shouting from the rooftops about the dangers that the Iranian nuclear program posed to them existentially, to the US, to the international community, et cetera. And again, like seemingly similar things, seemingly analogous cases. Iran and Syria are both large Middle Eastern non-democracies, autocracies, whatever you want to call it, hostile to the Israelis and their interests in the region, et cetera. And yet the Israelis use preventive military force in one case, the Syrian case, but not against the Iranians in the other case. And so I was like, what is going on here? Ultimately, this is the puzzle. These are the kinds of cases, kinds of things that I try to explain in this book. And the argument that I think we're going to get into as time goes on, the answer to the question, what explains this variation in the use of force as a counterproliferation strategy over time, I argue that we have to understand the leaders atop the state apparatus. So it's not just enough to talk about the US or the Israelis, but we got to break it down by presidential or prime ministerial administration to understand the leaders atop the state apparatus. how they think about nuclear weapons, what their beliefs are about the role nuclear weapons play or don't in international politics. And it's through understanding those beliefs, we can understand individual leaders' proclivities to the consideration and use of military force or not.
Rachel, this is fascinating. I want to pick up on the last point that you just made, which has to do with your argument and your analysis. You're really focused, as you just said, on decision makers, their prior beliefs, and the ways that they influence their decisions about proliferation challenges once they get into office. In a lot of ways, as I was reading your book, it struck me that this, so to speak, leader-centric model fits in really neatly with a bigger resurgence of interest in IR scholarship, in the first image, or this focus on the individual. So I'd love to hear, you talk about this a bit in your book, but from your perspective, what kind of explains first that resurgence of interest? And then I guess more specifically from your own perspective as a scholar, like what led you to make the individual the unit of analysis for your book?
Sure. So first question first, like how did we get here as a field, I guess? And to my mind, it's not any one thing, any one particular development. My sense of the nature and evolution of a field like political science and international relations within it is that there are ebbs and flows over time, and the pendulum sort of shifts in one direction and then it shifts in the other direction. And that is both about the kinds of questions that people are asking, the types of arguments that they are advancing as the answers to some of those questions, the methodological preferences or counter preferences that people might have. So I think if we look maybe evolutionarily at the development and the evolution of the discipline over time, we can sort of see shifts in priorities and preferences in the tools that people are bringing to bear, not just now, but sort of if we take the long view. So I think I kind of understand the return, the resurgence to a focus on leaders. The first image, first of all, it's a return, right? Because we used to do this all the time earlier in the scholarship, and then we forgot and it fell out of favor. We didn't forget. We decided to think about other things and other kinds of questions, other kinds of methodological advancements meant that the field moved elsewhere to, more easily quantifiable, perhaps more readily quantifiable data sources and questions and answers, et cetera. And so our return now is I think, both a reflection of where we have been previously, maybe focus, some might say over focus on some of the systemic level grand theory type things that people used to be working on, and a return to more mid-range theory, problem-driven or question-driven research. And I also think there's a general trend towards explaining and exploring what people are terming the micro foundations within the literature. So understanding sort of the lower level factors that might undergird or underlie some of the phenomenon that we are interested in. So you might think, the discipline at the moment is really focusing on understanding group decision-making and understanding the individual level aggregation that goes into group decision-making. So I think that's a kind of long-winded answer to say, I understand this resurgence of leader-focused literature in the nuclear scholarship, but more broadly within international relations and in political science within that larger evolution. The second thing you asked, Sarah, was how I got here, in particular as the argument that I advance in this book. And I'd love to tell you that I came in ex ante with the notion that this was all going to be a story about leaders, but that would be disingenuous because the truth is I hypothesized a bunch of other stuff was going on first. And largely those other hypotheses now show up as alternative explanations. But I went into this with priors that told me maybe it was a bureaucratic politics story, or maybe it was a structural story about the distribution of power, for example, within international politics. And only after the evidence was overwhelmingly not supporting any of those things did I sort of come around to the idea that there is actually a leader-driven focus.
That's great, Rachel. I mean, so I find this so fascinating because, wanting to ask and answer a question is one thing, but then actually being able to do that with the data that you have available is different. I know in my own scholarship, I find it to be exciting and challenging to look at how leaders think and feel, especially in retrospect. So I'd love to hear a little bit about sort of how you went about establishing some of those prior beliefs of the leaders on whom you focus, and maybe what you found, not just rewarding, but also difficult about doing that kind of work, particularly from an historical perspective, using the archives to do that.
Sure. So I think you captured it brilliantly, Sarah, right? It's both exciting and challenging, or rewarding and frustrating, however we might want to sort of capture the dichotomy. So I think the way I would start would be to say that probably the most important thing for me to be able to establish the causal role of leaders and their beliefs in this book is to be able to temporally disaggregate the leaders' beliefs from the decision-making environment of the case itself. Which is a fancy way of saying, I want to be able to identify and define and code the leaders' beliefs about these important nuclear matters as early as I possibly can in their lives as individuals, ideally decades before they even think about becoming president of the United States, saying nothing of actually becoming president or prime minister or what have you. And the reason for this is because if I sold you a story that defined and coded these independent variables, these beliefs, right, these causal factors within the same time frame as the decision-making process of what to do against the Chinese nuclear program or what to do against the North Korean nuclear program, if that was all happening in the same context, you could rightly come to me and say, well, how do I know this isn't just words, right? That leaders aren't using, what you're calling beliefs instrumentally as their ability, as their way, their means of selling their desired policy outcome, right? I couldn't disentangle the outcome from the thing that I'm telling you is related to what's driving the process. So I went back as far as I could with each individual that I explore in this book to their youth, right? To their formative experiences, maybe in military service or previous political office or all of the above, depending on the individual, to try to figure out as early as I could, what did they think about international politics? When did they first start thinking about nuclear issues broadly, if ever? And what did they start to think about the role that nuclear weapons play in international politics, for good, for ill, everything under the sun? And so to put some proper nouns on this stuff, I went back into each of the presidential archives in the US context and look at things like John F. Kennedy's collegiate thesis, right? The notes that he took when he was a journalist immediately after World War II, the letters that George H.W. Bush wrote home to his family when he was a serviceman in World War II to see if I can find evidence of how they thought about the world, and especially, once the advent of nuclear weapons happens, what role nuclear weapons might play in international politics. So I take the long view, right, and try and build a really long historical timeline to the extent that I can, doing my best to separate those beliefs and the individual who holds them from what they're actually doing once they're the executive in charge of the decision-making process. And that sounds great, maybe, but it comes with a bunch of challenges. So on the great, fabulous, fascinating side, as anybody who has ever worked in an archive knows, it's a giant treasure hunt. You come upon stuff that is just wild and totally outside of the scope of what it is you are meant to be looking for, right? So in the Kennedy archive, there are boxes and folders that have, the lists of gifts that the Kennedys received when they got married, as well as all of the fancy dignitaries who were giving them those gifts. In the George H.W. Bush library, there's a ticket stub. That whole family is a huge baseball fan. And there are ticket stubs from a mid-century World Series that he attended. and the paltry amount of money this ticket costs compared to what those tickets go for in this day and age. I mean, it was just mind-blowing. Pictures, letters, memorabilia, arcana, like world history. And if you're, a nerd about this stuff, like all of us are, you could spend your life digging through a whole bunch of amazing, fascinating pieces of world history that most people don't even know exists, let alone actually get to look at and hold and leaf through. And that's wonderful, but it also means you could really quickly spend a lot of time not doing what you're meant to be doing, which is, writing your dissertation or writing your book or what have you. So this is sort of the duality of, this is a fascinating way to approach research, spending time in archives. And we are, especially in the United States, we have this amazing gift that archives exist, that we are able, under most circumstances, to go in and explore, our history. And obviously other countries have to a certain degree, similar institutions to that we get to avail ourselves of, which is amazing. But you can go down the wormhole really quickly and spend days, weeks, months, distracted, frankly, from what you're meant to be doing. I would be remiss to not also note that there's a pragmatic element to thinking about doing archival research, because it sounds cool, maybe, and fascinating. It's also slow. And in a world where writing a dissertation, getting a PhD, or being an academic has real time pressures, right? It's a very different beast to go and do archival work, whether in presidential archives or another kind of field work where you're doing a deep dive that is, quite research and labor intense. It's a very different model from taking an off the shelf data set that you can download, manipulate to very good ends, right? Useful ends, different questions, different types of research. These things are different and they involve trade-offs, and people should think about them before, diving in.
That's extremely interesting, Rachel. I do want to come back to this notion of taking the long view, as you called it, on leaders' beliefs. So going all the way back, perhaps to their youth, establishing those beliefs, coding them, and then later showing their causal relevance for the kinds of decisions that you look at. And I'm just curious whether that does not presuppose or require a certain continuity or stability in those nuclear beliefs. I mean, what do you do if you analyze a leader who's experienced considerable nuclear learning, whose views on nuclear weapons, on nuclear threats changed over the course of his lifetime? Or is that rather rare as far as your research shows?
Sure. So I don't think there's anything in my argument that requires consistency of beliefs over time. And I'm, intellectually quite amenable to the notion that people can learn, especially over a long period of time, and that beliefs, views about important topics like nuclear weapons can change over time. And yet, I happen to explore a variety of individuals whose beliefs remain reasonably consistent over time. And so that makes the task of tracing the formation of these beliefs through a pre-presidential period or a pre-executive period through to the executive office. It makes that task a bit less complicated in as much as the beliefs stay consistent, largely so over time. But I will say that I do encounter an example and talk through in the book what I describe as an evolution in George W. Bush, so Bush 43's beliefs. And I won't go as far as to say that they dramatically change in time 0 to time 1 or time 1 to time 2. But I would say that they evolve, and they evolve primarily because of the 9/11 experience. So, and of course, it's worth noting, by the way, that George W. Bush is a harder president to work with because he has, especially to someone like, I don't know, George H.W. Bush, his father, or John F. Kennedy, who had a long, relatively speaking, pre-presidential career. Someone like George W. Bush has a shorter, relevant pre-presidential career, and what he had was not terribly relevant for foreign affairs. But nevertheless, what we can glean from what we know currently about his pre-presidential experience and his worldviews, his pre-presidential views, he seemed to lack confidence in deterrence in the post-Cold War environment. So sort of the environment in which, he's growing up and then eventually running for presidential office. He talked about, especially on the campaign trail, but previously, a desire to build ballistic missile defense, right, as one way to help augment the US's insufficient capability to deter especially rogue states from threatening the United States. So that means, one, that he was a little bit lacking in confidence on the deterrence front, but also, two, that he was focused on state-based threats. And you sort of see this all over, his earlier record, some of the campaign materials that he and his team would put out before entering into presidential office, and even in their tenure before 9/11. Right. So their focus was really on state-based threats, including Iraq. 9/11, I would say, the shock of 9/11 has the experience of hardening his views, making George W. Bush even less confident in containing and deterring certain actors like rogue states in international politics. And adding something that I think wasn't there before, which was the focus on terrorism, and terrorism plus rogue states plus WMDs, right? Which of course we can understand in what happens eventually with the war in Iraq. So this is not a sea change, I think, in his beliefs, but, an evolution. He was thinking about Iraq way before he got into presidential office. But the nature of the threat that Iraq poses, still a rogue state, but now a rogue state that potentially has the WMD terrorism connection and the WMD potential, the threat sort of became a broader, more multifaceted consideration in the post 9/11 environment. And of course, we can understand, the direction that the administration is going to take doing preemption, or if you want to think of it that way, at least to use their terminology, consequently in light of that evolution.
That's super interesting. And of course, sort of intuitively, it makes sense that certain watershed moments would have an impact on those prior beliefs. And it really makes me think, I don't know whether you want to do further scholarship in this direction, but I guess you have your work cut out for you, because the extent to which the war in Ukraine, with its many nuclear dimensions, might have an impact on various world leaders' views of the nuclear threat. I think there's going to be a lot to study for scholars like you. But that's just as a side note. I did want to come back to what you noted before, that you went into writing this book not with the idea that this is going to be a book about leaders, that you put certain alternative explanations for the outcomes. You hinted at them briefly, but can you flesh out a little bit what alternative explanations you considered and why you found those to be less convincing?
Sure. So I started both in this project and in terms of the alternative explanations that are consistent across all of the chapters of the book, focusing on what we might call structural explanations. And there's a variety of different types of those explanations that I explore in the book. But one of them is, this idea that as one state observes a challenger state, an enemy state, an adversary state, trying to augment their capabilities, in this instance, through the acquisition of nuclear weapons, that first state will try to use military force to stop them. And the fact that that happens sometimes and other times not means we need something else than just that basic baseline understanding of how countries might interact in international politics. And so then I thought, okay, well, maybe it's something about the relative power distributions between states, right? Something about the dyad, state one, state two, the nature of the power distribution, how strong or weak, the relative capability distribution might be. So we might think that, only, how do I want to say this? Only when a strong state faces a comparatively weak state who is trying to acquire nuclear weapons and, sort of close the power gap, the power asymmetry, maybe that's the situation where we're going to see, or we should expect to see, the use of military force. But again, that's problematic. And I would point to the Israel chapter in the book. Today we often think about Israel as the strong, dominant military power, regional power in the Middle East. But in the 1980s, when Israel was facing, the Iraqi nuclear program, the Pakistani nuclear program, and then even into the 2000s when they were facing a Syrian nuclear program, by a number of metrics that we might use to think about relative power capabilities, whether it's the territorial size of Israel vis-a-vis the adversaries, the population size, et cetera, most metrics that we would think about would consider Israel to actually be the weak state, not the strong state, right? So in these cases, you've got a weaker state that has a stronger adversary who stands to actually get even stronger, like exacerbating that power asymmetry. And then is thinking about using military force. By the way, they don't always use military force, right? We don't know that the Israelis, or we never observed that the Israelis used military force against the Pakistani nuclear program when it was in formation. So there's even more variation across that particular or within that particular alternative explanation. And we kind of need to flip the explanation on its head from how the literature sort of thinks about it. I'll give you one other structural explanation that I explore, and then I'll tell you about a few others. There is this notion, right? And I think this sort of just makes sense to us as humans beyond just as political scientists, that maybe countries attack in easy cases, right? If it's an easy military mission, you deal with the problem militarily. And if it's too hard, then that's not when we're going to observe military force, right? So you use force when it's easy to do so and not otherwise. And that's like intuitively appealing, right? That kind of an explanation. But in fact, historically, we have a variety of instances where leaders either got very close to ordering the military intervention or actually used military force as a counterproliferation strategy when the expectations for the consequences of that action were nothing short of dire. So, for example, Menachem Begin in 1981 orders the strike on the Osirak Iraqi nuclear reactor, despite the fact that his military and intelligence apparatus is telling him, you're going to lose your entire Air Force fleet that you're sending, you're going to lose all of the pilots who are going to get shot down or killed in some way. And you're probably gonna catalyze a major war when the Iraqis come in retaliation, territorially try an onslaught into Israel. And Begin knew all of that and ordered the attack anyway, because he was so concerned about the potential future of an Iraq armed with nuclear weapons. President Clinton in the 1990s, facing a similar situation, perhaps, with the North Korean nuclear threat, had all kinds of terrible casualty estimates, cost figures for what a war on the Korean Peninsula would look like after a strike on the North Korean nuclear infrastructure, what that would portend. And he nearly ordered the intervention, but for the 11th hour sort of work of President Jimmy Carter, who, got us to what would eventually be the agreed framework. So in those cases and others, we've got evidence to sort of call into question that notion that you only attack in the easy cases. Let me tell you just one quick thing outside of the structural context. And I think, a lot of people, their instinct about what might be a plausible explanation for the types of policy decisions that I'm explaining in this book, you might think it's about the bureaucracy, right? It's about the cabinet, or it's about the interagency process in the US context, something about the bureaucracy, either pulling and hauling, to think about our bureaucratic politics language, might be what drives the options that are pursued or not. Or something about, especially gifted cabinet members, right, who are actually driving the process. And it's not the leaders per se, but, something about the bureaucracy or the apparatus that the leader sits atop. And I show, especially in the China case, where it's really important to address this potential alternative, but elsewhere in the book also, how we should call into question the bureaucratic politics alternative. And briefly, I would mention that there's really something interesting about the China case, right? In that we know President Johnson comes in, or Johnson becomes President Johnson in the aftermath of the Kennedy assassination. And we might have thought, right, that the change in behavior, the fact that Kennedy was seriously considering a military option against the Chinese nuclear program, and then Johnson, shows no serious consideration of that possible military intervention. Maybe it's something about the people who inhabit the Johnson administration, right? Like the newly ushered in Johnson administration, as opposed to those who had populated the Kennedy administration. But what's interesting is that part of what Johnson does when he comes into office after the assassination, he's really focused on keeping continuity from the Kennedy administration to his new administration. And he keeps the identical cabinet from the Kennedy period to this part of the Johnson administration, and to a man, right? And I'm sorry, it is man in this era that we're talking about, but literally the identical cabinet. And yet, despite that identical cabinet, we see significant change in the policy that the Johnson administration will pursue or not once they come into office. So that tells us it's not just the cabinet doing the work. We got to focus elsewhere. And again, we come back to the role of the leaders.
That's super
interesting. This is so great, Rachel. I mean, oh, sorry, Hannah. Wait, is it your turn?
I know you want to come in with the next question, but I did want to ask a tiny follow-up just because you've talked about China. And I think our listeners would be really interested in hearing why it is that there hasn't been a counterproliferation strike against Iran, given the concern that we see with the Iranian program today. Is it that, for the longest time, individual leaders who were perhaps contemplating the use of force against Iran didn't see the program as such a threat at that point in time, and the concern has risen mostly in recent years? Or what's your explanation here?
So I think the first thing I would say is this story is not finished yet. And I think this is one of the, really important elements of the nuclear landscape currently that we need to be paying attention to. And it is not a foregone conclusion that we will or we won't see the use of military force in the Iranian context. And especially as they have been advancing their centrifuge capacity, enriching uranium up to 85, almost 90% in today. They're making significant strides, really shrinking basically to nothing their breakout potential. That's making other folks in the international community nervous. And yet, right, according to the American intelligence, the Israeli intelligence, they have not made the decision. The Iranians have not made the decision to weaponize. So, it's a little bit ambiguous where this case is heading. But I think it is too soon to tell whether or not we could be heading in the direction of the use of force. And so that means that we need to pay attention to who's in office in the relevant countries right now. Right, Bibi Netanyahu, who we are still talking about, has some real challenges domestically that might cause him to return to a focus on the Iranian nuclear threat. And Bibi has been quite vocal throughout his very long political tenure as prime minister and otherwise about the existential threat that the Iranian nuclear capability poses to Israel and the others. And yet there are some reasons to think that he might be a lot of talk and less action, especially because there are other things moving in this space, like the role of the Russians, for example, in potentially protecting the Iranians to a certain degree. And of course, one of the things that makes the Iran case really interesting is that it's a triad as opposed to just a dyad. So, in earlier elements of the Iran story where, for example, the Israelis might have thought about using military force to forestall the nuclear weapons acquisition, things like the Iran nuclear deal were orchestrated in order, to do many things. But one of the things that deal was meant to do was to prevent or postpone the Israeli use of military force against Iran. So bottom line, stay tuned.
Well, I was so eager to jump in the previous question, but I'm actually really glad that Hannah took that little divergence, because it leads perfectly into what I want to ask you about, which is, your book is looking at counterproliferation strikes, but the central finding, which is that, what leaders believe before they enter office shapes and influences their behavior once they're there. I mean, it seems to me like that has really far-reaching implications for other areas of policymaking. So we were just talking about other areas of nuclear decision-making, but I'm thinking here more broadly about, policymaking sort of writ large. So if you could, wave a magic wand, have any set of archival information that you wanted or any data set that you wanted that would allow you to test your findings against other aspects of kind of nuclear decision-making broadly, I'm curious to know, like, what would those be? Would they be decisions about nuclear use, decisions about whether to acquire nuclear weapons, whether to join treaties? Like, what would you want to explore and test your findings against?
Sure. So, this is a really fascinating space to be inhabiting at the moment, because there's so many different elements of work, both on the leaders front, but also so many important nuclear questions that we are still exploring and need good answers to. So I think I would answer your question two ways, both slightly expanding my model, strictly speaking. So the first, I'm really interested in this question of nuclear learning and what people learn under what conditions, because we have a variety of conflicting ideas, right? On the one hand, that shocks can cause belief change, but also that shocks could cause belief assimilation, right? You harden your beliefs. And we don't necessarily have a great understanding of the conditions under which one thing or the other will happen. Similarly, and I know you've talked to Nick Miller in a previous episode, so this came up. We don't have great understandings of why different people in the same country learn different things from different episodes in the nuclear context or otherwise. We could use a better understanding of not learning from a particular environment in an abstract sense, but how leaders learn, say, from previous leaders about their nuclear experiences in terms of what impact that might have on, say, the use of nuclear weapons, whether it's from a coercive element or a deployment perspective. Like, what do you learn from what the previous person did that you do similarly or differently? So I think there's a variety of questions in this, I will just call it nuclear learning space. And of course, there's a lot happening in the Ukraine context specifically that could give us important data to continue pursuing, fruitful research questions in this avenue. The other thing I would say is that, in this book, I'm looking at national executives, presidents and prime ministers, but I'm amenable to the fact that other leaders, more broadly conceived, can be consequential in nuclear matters. So, for example, with a couple of colleagues, I have an arms control project that's looking at individuals, be they leaders, heads of state, foreign ministers, lead negotiators, right? And their personal characteristics or some of their individual experiences, and also relationally, like me as a head negotiator from one country, you as the head negotiator from another country, relationally, are there characteristics that we might have in common that might lead to negotiation success? So, I think there's a number of questions about the role of people, if we can broaden it out a little bit from leaders, to think about the role that people broadly may play in a variety of areas of consequence that we're concerned with in the nuclear realm.
Rachel, can we just build on this last point? And I'd like to hear you reflect a little on how your research can be directly useful for policy. I mean, you said earlier, with the Iran case, we have to stay alert and we should be paying attention to those who are in office at the moment, such as Bibi Netanyahu. So is the sort of utility of this for policy mostly about being able to anticipate potential counterproliferation strikes, because we we are aware of who's in office and what they might do? Or is it this point that you just made about understanding personalities sort of more broadly, and then understanding what could be conducive to negotiation? I mean, can you just talk a little bit sort of to the policy implications here?
Sure. So this is a really, personally consequential question, in the sense that I spend a lot of my time formally and informally, thinking about ways to bridge the gap, right? I'm involved with the Bridging the Gap initiative, and both as a scholar, as a person, I'm inclined towards thinking that there's a role for academics to play in contributing to the policy process. And I'm inclined towards policy relevant questions, as this book demonstrates. That said, I take a very broad view of how one can contribute to the policy process or the policy landscape. And I think, Hanna, you noted an obvious and maybe most important implication from this book is that, if we want to know who might be likely to use preventive military force as a counterproliferation strategy in some future scenario, we should pay attention to the leaders atop the relevant states and see what their pre-presidential views, pre-executive views suggest for how they are likely to behave in executive office facing some particular adversary. So that's the sort of the immediate takeaway from this book. More broadly, more liberally, I think there's an argument in here for knowing our history, right? Yes, I'm looking at Cold War cases going back to John F. Kennedy and LBJ, right, in the 1960s. But as our conversation today demonstrates, this is of relevance for the contemporary environment, right? And it is not news that we do a particularly poor job, especially here in the United States, on history education and making sure that our youth and our population knows history, not because it's perfectly comparable to what's happening now, but because there are interesting things to know and signposts that might be relevant in today's age or tomorrow. I also think that there's a variety of different ways that we can contribute to the policy process as academics, right? I have no illusion that any policymaker is going to be picking up this book and doing anything with it, or reading any journal article that I might have written or ever write in the future. But one of the benefits of living in this day and age is that there are a variety of outlets, whether they're short form policy pieces, podcasts such as this one, right, that are able to communicate to a very broad audience of current policymakers, but also future policymakers. And I think that's a really important way that academics can contribute to the civic conversation and the policymaking process more broadly. And that means that, us as citizens, right, in whatever country, can pay attention to these issues, our leaders, our future leaders, right? Because they're leaving behind a paper trail that we can explore. And we can think about every time we have the opportunity and the privilege to go into the voting booth, right? These people are telling us stuff about how they might be as leaders one day. And I think it is our civic obligation, especially if we have the privilege of living in a democracy, to take advantage of that information and use it. Last thing I will say, because this has turned into a long answer, in the classroom, right? That is a way that we can have policy relevance. Right? Even though I'm in Atlanta, Georgia, if you poll my students in US foreign policy, my undergrads, at least half the room is going to raise their hand and say, I want to be in the foreign service, or I want to be, contributing to the policymaking process one day in London or Brussels or Washington or what have you. And so we have all day, every day in the classroom, the ability to engage with future policymakers or future members of the policymaking community, broadly conceived, and getting in the classroom and encouraging people to read and think and be critical consumers on these really important topics can contribute to the policymaking process over the very long run.
Rachel, thank you so much. I feel like that is such a perfect note to end this conversation on, especially given that, we're at an academic institution, you're at an academic institution. I really appreciate you bringing home the ways in which our research can sort of touch different stakeholders and thinking about who those stakeholders are more broadly. So thank you both for that response and for this question more generally and our conversation. I found it to be fascinating, and I want to thank you again for making the time and being our guest.
It has been wonderful to join you, and thank you so much for having me.